as I said, the idea that days could be different has an ancient pedigree. I wouldn't put it on the Bible, though, because, I mean, in the Bible, different things happen on those 7 days, but there's nothing in the rest of, pretty much in the rest of the Tanakh, but certainly in the Chumash and the Nevi'im, that suggests that anyone lived by a calendar in which those days met. In fact, there's no evidence people live by that calendar at all. The first 6 days have different character. Nowhere does it say that anyone sought to imitate the act of creation by doing things appropriate to what was created on that day at all. And there's nothing in the Genesis narrative that even suggests that people are going to commemorate the 6 days of work through a continuous cycle of 7 days. You can as easily imagine that people who wanted to imitate that would imitate that or commemorate that by resting on the 7th day of every lunar month, the 7th day of every year, defined however, the 7th day of their lives. I mean, there are many ways, and the Bible gives none of that because no one in the Bible seems to be living by the week until you really get to, say, Ezra and Nehemiah. But this is not. I'll talk about that, but yeah, no, but it is true that the 19th century Americans didn't invent the idea that consecutive days might be different. I think the Roman planetary week is a clear source of that, but there are lots of folkloric traditions, European as well as African, that were kept alive through the period I studied, that clearly treat the days as having distinctive. Think of Friday, for example, as a bad luck day, just to take the most common and obvious, is that. There's nothing about its distance from the Sabbath that makes Friday special. And there may be something related to the crucifixion, but there's nothing about its relation to the other days of the week that would make it special. Or, you know, children's poems that were common in the 19th century and are still...
Wednesday's child full of woe.
Exactly, right? So you notice in the Wednesday... were you born on a Wednesday?
Open, right.
So, no, I'm wondering whether you felt great sympathy for the Wednesday child.
That's the day I was born, and that's the reason Wednesday Addams is called Wednesday Addams.
It is.
Wednesday's child.
I knew the last thing. I did not know that you were born on Wednesday, but I wondered whether maybe you were, because it tends to be people born on Wednesday who remember that poem from their child. Anyway, so those traditions are I do think register a conception of the week that's not about order, hierarchy, or relationship to the Sabbath. Because it's not like they sometimes have a Sabbatarian element, like don't cut your nails on Sunday thing, but for the most part they don't have any relationship of order or hierarchy. So there are a lot of traditions that treat the days of the week in that way. What was new in the 19th century, and not entirely new because market days had done this in various societies before, but what was new in the 19th century was the common experience of most people needing to know what day of the week it was because their activities would be different. This is something that we take for granted, but that is probably less true of people who were born in the 21st century in the United States than people who were born in the 20th century, which is that many of the things that you do, or what you think of as a regular basis, you actually do every 7 days, or you only do on certain days of the week. Whereas we don't have things that we do every 9 days or every 11 days, and those things, and those things are accumulate to such an extent that when you think it's a Tuesday and it turns out to be Wednesday, it's usually a problem. And sometimes it's a problem because you miss an appointment. Often it's a problem because you just feel untethered from your schedule. Even though it's perfectly natural not to know what day of the week it is, because there's nothing in nature that would ever tell you what day of the week it is. And yet, we've become so habituated to weekly schedules that becomes even a singular symptom of cognitive decline, to not know. Whereas not knowing what day of the month it is usually not a problem, unless it's your mother's birthday and you forgot it, and that's a problem.
First of all, fascinating and phenomenal.
Thank you.
Something that I thought about when going through your work, aside like diaries and almanacs, which was the citizenry, and which was what the citizens were doing in the States. How involved was the government in facilitating the week culture and the whole American customs that we see with the week days and everything?
Yeah. I would say, from my perspective, surprisingly little, but there are a lot of examples of it. So maybe you might not think of this as so little. So, for example, the government did things like decide when courts would meet. And those were almost always pegged to a day of the week. Not that they were necessarily weekly, but courts in this state, this term will meet on Mondays. Right? They set the days of elections. And they often they decided when city councils would meet. So I see it as not so significant because I see them as simply among the participants in the creation of those schedules. So from the perspective of like state capacity, it might be interesting that the government does that too. But for the most part, I think that, yeah, banks do that, and movie theaters do that, and school principals do that, and the people who design elections do that too. I see those as comparable. The government does a whole lot of that, but in the grand scheme of the producers of this weekly schedule, I wouldn't assign them a special role. But again, if you approach this question not from, as I do, from the perspective of the users of the week, but thinking of the history of the government, it is significant the government does some stuff. To my mind, one of the most interesting things the government does, but this is not actually important to most people, the government defines when the week begins. In other words, law does. It's typically the product of lots of different judicial decisions and administrative legal decisions. But yeah, in 19th century, by American law, the week began on Sunday, right? The midnight crossing from Saturday to Sunday, which I think reflected rather than created a conception of the week that continues to distinguish the United States from many other parts of the world, where wall calendars in Europe are far likelier, for example, to begin the week on Monday, and the U.S. more likely to begin Sunday. When kids learn the days of the week in Europe, it's always with Monday. In the U.S., it's kind of split. I haven't studied this systematically, but it seems, on the basis of all the questions I've asked people about their childhood, that they're just alike to them. So the reason why the U.S., I think, tends to favor a counting of the week that treats Sunday as the first day is entirely theological and is really about Puritan Sabbatarianism, and I think that the legal decisions reflected that. Whereas in many other parts of the Christian world, and subsequently the non-Christian world, that didn't really matter, or that was theologically rejected in the case of Catholics and the Anglican Church. So it just makes more sense if you think of the work week as beginning on Monday, and the other thing as being a weekend to start on Monday. So, anyway, but that's the weird. I think the government does weigh in on that question that people are always asking me about. But other than that, I feel like the government was really one of a number of participants in this process of scheduling things with the weekly calendar rather than the monthly calendar.
Yoav.
Thank you. You present several examples of how the concept of the week was countered by people. I'm wondering about labor and work, and when, if and when do you identify that there are measurements by weekly output or weekly quotas for enslaved people or stuff like that that are not like only monthly, or in terms of improving productivity in different labor regimes in 19th century America.
Yeah, so the week is the dominant counting device for many labor regimes, both free and enslaved, in the 19th century. Productivity is sometimes measured by the month, but because workers are employed by the week, not universally, but far more than even in the 20th century or the 18th century. Workers getting paid by the week and getting contracted by the week became dominant in the 19th century. So that's part of what pushed it. But I'd say in some ways the industrial use of one of the things one way to characterize what we're talking about is the industrial use of the week, typically by capital, but you could think about it from the labor side too. That was very strong. I would say that that is an extension of the industrial logic of the Sabbatarian week all along. I mean, the idea of 6 days you work and 1 day you rest is a fundamentally industrial conception of time. It is conducive to buying a worker's time, disciplining workers' time rather than simply paying for a product, etc. And it is an early example of the temporal segregation of work and leisure that we think of as being one of the hallmarks of industrial change. So it makes sense to me that it was used that way. It did cause accounting problems. And the accounting problems have to do with something I haven't spoken about, but would be happy to say more, which is one of the weird things with the week is it doesn't fit into any larger time unit. And so, because for some purposes the month was important, and for many purposes the year was important from the perspective of capital, it was super inconvenient that the number of weeks was not. So I think that it's all the more striking that if you look at the account books both of plantation owners and of industrial employers, they continue to look at the week. The books are often set up sometimes by the week if it's a pay book. If it's something else, it might be set up by the month. But then they have to actually rewrite them. They have to cross out certain days to make it fit the week. And that's why so many American businesses in the late 19th century supported the reform movement to change the week, because it didn't actually fit, and they wanted instead a week that was an even division of a year and would remain stable for bookkeeping purposes. Some of them even adopted that. Famously, the Kodak Corporation, whose president and owner was a major crusader for time reform, insisted that all of their corporate offices all use a different weekly schedule. It wouldn't have been a problem, though, had they not been using the week all along as the basis for both paying and assessing productivity.
I want to ask, since I'm working with accountants of the War Department and like military pay bureaucracy records, this is a heterogeneous week there, right? Because there is no Sabbath. The money has to be calculated, but every day is a work day, so it's I think it's a very fascinating counterpoint to
yeah. So it's more than heterogeneous. That's even it's almost like obliterates the week, right? Because it's a continuous calendar that has no blank days at all.
Every day is every day. Every
day is every day. Yeah. No, I mean, and one might argue that that's increasingly the norm for lots of corporations today. They not only depend on continuous operation, but they may have a continuous conception of the relationship between time and labor. But I think that that's unusual for the 19th century, as far as I know. Yeah.
Oh, and then we'll move over to this side.
Thanks very much. Very interesting. I wanted to ask two things. First of all, I can understand sort of why 19th century, why early 19th century, since the very clear concept, like connection you see between the week and the Heritage Week and modernity. Do you see something specific in the United States in that regard to that period? And another thing related to that, just curiously, I could think of the United States the only place where so many holidays are actually by the weekday rather than by the date. Yeah. When did that come about? Is that something is that related to the overall,
I think it's related to the story I'm telling in the book, and I'm not sure it's related to the story I was telling today. Okay, so here's what I would say. I studied the United States because that was the only society that I felt qualified to study, and I was constantly thinking about how much of this is a U.S. story, fully knowing that I'm never really going to do this comparable research for Turkey or Egypt or Brazil. But the reason why it seems likely the United States would be at the vanguard or maybe even an outlier is the United States was an especially week-oriented society even before the story that my story begins. From its settler colonial days, and especially maybe after the Revolution, the United States had a calendar that had been stripped of shared anniversary days. This is generally truer, say, Protestant than non-Protestant societies in the 18th and 19th and 19th century. Both Catholic Europe, for example, and Orthodox Europe and Church of England had calendars full of red letter days and saints' days and feast days. So it was really important to know what the date of the Gregorian calendar was. Whereas most of the people who moved from Africa or to Europe to North America in, say, the 18th century left behind or deliberately abandoned or had always rejected that kind of calendar. And it was a fairly Sabbatarian society, most famously in New England, where Sabbath keeping a rigorous understanding of Sabbath prohibitions were in place and enforced, but even in other parts of British North America, and then again through the United States. European visitors always noticed this. So this was a society where people were already super attuned to the week. They didn't have a lot of other holidays, and they kept the Sabbath. And even among enslaved people, it was far more common in the West Indies, for example, or in Brazil, for enslaved people to work a continuous schedule. It was very uncommon for Sunday to be identical to Saturday on the plantation for anyone, both for the enslavers and for the enslaved. So already it was something of a week-heavy society, and there weren't a lot of holidays at all. The Saints' Days had been jettisoned, and the commemorative historical holidays of the colonial period had been rejected after the Revolution. So really, July 4th, and then Washington's birthday to some extent, were these atypical holidays, and they stood out. And then over time, as other holidays were added, they tended to be subordinated to the weekly calendar for reasons that make sense to me. I haven't found the place where someone argues for it, but I'll take the example of Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving becomes a national holiday essentially during the Civil War, but it had always been a Thursday. When it was a regional religious festival in New England, it was on a Thursday. It wasn't even always in November, but it was always on a Thursday. If you see this as a battle between the Gregorian calendar and the weekly calendar for the organization of festive time, I don't think the Gregorian calendar really stood a chance in this country, because the weekly calendar had really been in control of that from the beginning. So.
Irene, Michael, are you still waiting? And then Cody.
So you already started to move toward this, but and this is sort of outside the claims that you brought, but how do you understand the week in a post-pandemic moment? I mean, has the pandemic obliterated the week, and if so, in relationship to your answer to Yoav, I think, was that something that was going to happen anyway, or was it something that was in some way sort of incited by?
Yeah, so thank you, Erin. I sort of don't think the pandemic is the big culprit or savior here. I think that the things that the pandemic is imagined to have done were already in place, and I did take them quite seriously as I was writing this book. It's often the case that I write about something that I think is I take for granted, it was so central to my childhood and that of everyone in my generation, but might actually be unraveling. Whether it's snail mail or certain kinds of experiences of the city, or in this case the week. It was something I thought might be unraveling, and I think it was a little bit well before the pandemic, because of things like telecommuting, the breakdown of the temporal divide between work and leisure, and also, so kind of, in some ways even more crucially, the breakdown or the reduction in forms of synchronous entertainment and commerce. The fact that when I'm making the case that so many things that put the week in place were the fact that the bank was open certain days and the theater was open on certain days, and people did certain activities at the same time on certain days, all dependent on that kind of social synchronizing that seemed to be breaking down. TV would be the most obvious example. Synchronized entertainment was hugely important in, say, the 1970s and 1980s to the conception of the week, both because most people were entertained by the same small number of things, and because those small number of things were all on weekly schedules. So now all of that's gone, except for in the U.S., very, very significant exception of spectator sports, and especially football, which is what Americans call football. Not football.
We know.
Sorry?
We know.
Okay. Right. American Studies program needs to know that silly, violent game that causes people to kill themselves from head injuries is called football. So that is a form of commercial entertainment that is very much organized around the week. It's extraordinarily popular, and for many people does actually. So there are exceptions, but those things were all in place in the pandemic. The pandemic came, and instead, my reaction, and this is not like, I'm sure we all have different takes on this, but I'm not claiming any authority here by virtue of the fact that I studied in the past, but just to attest to what my experience was like, wow, it's really surprising that people are complaining right now that they don't know what day of the week it is. Like, what did the pandemic actually do distinctively to the week that hadn't already been done? The pandemic seemed to shut down, at least in the U.S., it may have been actually more intense, I don't know, really seemed to unsettle the difference between day and night. It seemed to really sort of, like, people didn't say what time of day is it or what time of night it is. That's what you expect, or what time of year. I mean, all these annual rituals, opening day of spring training, graduation and prom and Easter dinner, all these things were upended or curtailed or transformed by the pandemic, and so what time of year it is was a question that would have made more sense. But they all seem to be talking about the week, so that made me think, people seem really, really attached to the week, so that when they are unmoored from their rhythms, that's what they want to cling to. And then it may become hard to know what day of the week it is, for the same reason it might have been a little harder 3 years ago also. But now it seems more kind of existentially. So that's a very personal answer to this. I do think that there are forces that ought to be undermining the grip of the week on us. One of them, I should say, since I mentioned scheduling a lot, is electronic calendars. Electronic calendars that allow people to make appointments without remembering them. That's a huge, if I'm right about what put the week really lodged it in people's minds in the 1850s, well, that ought to make a big difference if you don't have to remember your appointment, because when you wake up in the morning, and so you could have a relationship with a psychotherapist where you see him or her on 5 different days of the week over the next 5 weeks, and that's fine because your electronic calendars will reassure you both that it doesn't collide with other appointments. That's what the week was. Well, it was like genius of the week. The genius of the week was to sequester those appointments in memorable ways, so you could go about your business and still have a lot of relationships with a lot of different people. Now the devices seem to allow you to do that. Schools. It allows schools to engage in block scheduling. Formats that I think would have been very hard before. So I definitely believe that many things about our brave new world of technology ought to be having some effect on this story. But the week is very, very entrenched, and I think it will take a lot for it to dislodge us from it. And the failed attempts to formally change the week, I think, are evidence of our in some ways difficult to explain attachment to that. You were next.
I don't know about you. I remember when stores were closed on Sunday in America. Mm-hmm. So it strikes me the week has changed in certain respects. So
Yeah, I mean, continuous commerce is one of those things that's not the creation of the pandemic. That was
Oh, no,
yeah.
Right. Pandemic and then anything just accelerated everything, right? Okay, so I have one anecdote and one question.
Okay.
So the anecdote is this. So my father claims American civilization ended when they began to play the World Series at night. And that's because prior to that, everyone watched or listened together at work. And once, of course, the games were broadcast at night, everyone was alone at home. Apparently, this probably also enhanced productivity in the workplace, apropos of Yoav's and query from before. But what it did from the 70s on was it accelerate the privatization of everyday experience. So let me get back to the everyday. So for Brodel, everyday life was a largely pre-modern phenomenon. But I'm thinking of another Frenchman, no less influential, named Foucault, who argued that in fact that everyday or the everyday or the ordinary becomes particularly important and particularly noticed in an industrializing world. So how would you play with that?
All right. Well, so first I'm about the World Series.
But first, the World Series.
The World Series. If you guys are all probably either following or notably not following the Mondial, I think we all understand that a game can be played any time of the day and still create public gatherings in public space for people to watch it. So I think your father's concerns about the World Series becoming privatized might be overblown. But maybe your father just didn't like going to bars. I don't know. It probably won't surprise you, given the option of thinking of the everyday. I don't think of Brodel as thinking of it as peculiarly pre-modern. I think of him thinking of it in some ways as a methodological tool to study any society. He just applied it to a pre-modern, as opposed to Foucault's sense of it as being modern. I'm certainly on the Foucault side of that. The idea of the day as a fundamental unit of experience, whether you think it should be obliterated by the concept of the everyday, or whether you think it should be rehabilitated and re-inhabited, I think those are both modern questions, and it's and they are particular to, maybe unique to, the modern period. So yeah, that would be my approach here. I mean, one of the challenges of writing this book is. The first one is persuading people, which is not at all original to me and shouldn't be hard, but it seems to be what I do a lot here now. Persuading people that there is no natural basis for the week. No one has asked that question yet. I'm surprised, but this is a very sophisticated crowd. But the other one is combating the perception that essentially, and this view I do understand and sympathize, that essentially this is an ancient technology. Whether it's the idea that really the Bible anticipates the heterogeneity of days, or that the Sabbath had an industrial logic long before the Industrial Revolution. So that's true. And so much of what I'm struggling to do is to figure out what is peculiarly modern about this ancient technology, because it is an ancient technology. And I do think that thinking of the day as a significant unit of time means something different in the modern world, and the resistance to that is also a kind of modern resistance. The resistance to the rejection of the perspective of the daily newspaper and the hasty awareness of blah, 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 is also, I think, those are both modern moves. So I am trying to figure out what is peculiarly modern in the application of admittedly an ancient technology. But I like the way you frame it as a debate between Brodel and Foucault, and that's an easy choice for me. But,
Karim.
Okay, so it's a weird question.
Yeah.
So I'm coming back to the first example that you gave us. If you remember Tuesday as the day that your loved one died, and the fact that it's a Tuesday is more important to you than the date in the calendar, then every Tuesday is the anniversary of the death of your loved one.
Cool. Yeah.
So that makes the 7-day week the basic memory unit. So no day is the same within the week, but every week is the same. And I can imagine an industrial society planning their life week by week, but I can't imagine an agricultural society planning.
You can or cannot?
Cannot. By the week, because
Right.
I mean, an agricultural society needs to plan for the winter, so the basic memory units should be longer.
Right. I mean, agricultural society should have a problem with the week altogether, and that's one of the explanations for why the weekly experience that I'm talking about doesn't arise until the United States becomes less predominantly an agricultural society. But let me be clear. The guy in my anecdote didn't want to celebrate every. Some people do that. Some people feel.
To celebrate every, but he remembers the.
Correct.
Day of the week is more important to him than the day
Right.
of the calendar.
So there are two ways of thinking about this psychologically. I mean, I have a friend whose mother died on the Monday before Thanksgiving. This gets back to the question about the scheduling of holidays. So for her, the anniversary of her mother's death is the Monday before Thanksgiving, which itself is a non-Gregorian or semi-Gregorian occasion, because it has to be the fourth Thursday of the month, but I always do it. So she's not thinking about her mother every Monday. She's just thinking about her mother every Monday before Thanksgiving. So that's one sort of option. But the other thing, which I actually like, is that there may be a way in which people who have a deep, maybe let's say a traumatic association with something that happened on particularly will actually relive it every week. Practically speaking, that's a cool idea. I think you're right that that's like maybe an indulgence that one can't have in an agricultural society, but it might describe how some of us are. The best example I can think of is the common observation that in many industrial societies, Sunday is the most common day for a suicide. So. All right. Now, I mean, you could explain that as like, oh, people really, really don't want to go to work, right? That wouldn't work here, right? Because you're already at work. But another way to think of it is Sunday night relives traumas of past Sunday nights. An anecdote that I begin with the book comes from Murakami's 1Q84, where one of the protagonists has a kind of experience of every Sunday that is entirely a reliving of an unpleasant ritual he engaged in with his father as a child. So I mean, when you're talking about trauma, I think it is possible that people live that way. But I take your point that there are a lot of societies, maybe not just agricultural ones, where the difference between times of year would have to obliterate whatever continuity the recurring Tuesday might have. That's the cool thing to think about. Thank you.
Nell?
Thanks a lot. I have a question regarding the relations between the weekly cycle and two other very important cycles that change at the same time. And one is the hourly cycle, so clocks, and they're becoming much more important than ever before. And the other is the day-night cycle, or what we can call the every night. We talked about the every day, but the every night also changes. And it's important because, for example, determining when a day, it's not just when the week starts, but when Monday turns into Tuesday. And for example, because there are many more people working nights, this may be important for them to know, not just when, what time it is, but when a new day starts, and night shifts, and the rest of it. And it also ties, so it's a question, it's a historical question about the time you're studying, but it also ties into what was discussed here, which I think we can call, following Jonathan Crary's important book from 2013, the 24/7.
Yeah.
This is what we're talking about, the 24/7 society in which we may be living today. Crary's argument basically is that one of the most important things that distances us today from the society you are seeing kind of coming up, developing, is the use of nighttime for consuming and production, the things you mentioned. So the fact that night is being eroded, nearly extinct, he says, is one of the things that sends us from the reality you're describing to what we may be experiencing today of, differential temporal structures.
Right. I completely agree with that. I would divide the phenomenon, though, into two things, one of which I think is about my story and the other is not, which is not. The part that's not because it's not important, but because I think it's a somewhat different phenomenon, though it has a similar chronology, is changes in day and night or in the hour that are about precise reckoning, including the introduction of equal length hours. So this is something several of you know much more about than I do, but in many societies, the introduction of Gregorian calendar coincided with the introduction of equal hours. Thinking of the day as divided into 24 equal hours as opposed to thinking of the daylight time as divided into 12 equal but changing hours. Right? So that and other changes in the border between day and night in the industrial era, so it is contemporary with my story, are really about the replacement of natural time with artificial time. Now that is an interesting coincidental phenomenon that I'm talking about, but mine, of course, is not exactly about that because the week was never about natural time. It remains about artificial time, and it penetrates different societies in different ways, and a lot of societies for which the equal hour was a big, or the Gregorian calendar was a big revolution. The week wasn't because the week was already there, and vice versa.
What about train time, for example?
Right.
This would mean, specific train leaving on particular days of the week and particular times of the week. And this. Okay,
but again, I would divide that. The precise reckoning of time that the railroads introduced, and things like mean time zones, etc., are really about a kind of structural transformation of time to make it more artificial. The week doesn't do that, but as you say, it has implications for the experience of the week, at least at the edges. So I don't want to say much about that because it's a big subject, but that is a weird thing, which is that the modernization of time involved both the spread of a differentiated weekly schedule and the replacement of natural or local time measurements with uniform, standardized, artificial ones. Those sound like similar things, but I actually don't think that they're the same. The other thing that Avner, you're talking about is very much is sort of my answer to Irene's question, which is the 24/7 business. And one of the points that Jonathan Curry makes in that book is that 24/7 is technically a redundancy, right? Why do we need to be told 7 once we're already told 24? When you break, if you break down the different hours, then of course you break down the difference between. But it is a separate trauma or a separate social revolution to also break down that, and that had been happening before the pandemic, which is why I'm not inclined to make too much of the pandemic. That is extremely important, and that is a part of the that is a potentially destabilizing force against the regime that I'm seeing is built up in the 19th century. I would add one more thing to that, which is the communication and synchronization of activities across the globe. It's probably familiar to many people in this room who work with people in very distant time zones. That also winds up destabilizing the week and creating 24/7 in different ways. And also in some ways creating ambiguity about where we are in the week. The international dateline as a concept, as well as the technologies that both make it possible and make it useful to have one, are all part of this story about threats to the kind of week that I'm talking. So yes, it's a long way of saying yes. So.
Okay, last question goes to you, and then
there are clashes over Sabbath observance and so over what's supposed to happen in particular days of the week. It's a great question. I did not find in the 19th century records of immigrants who were encountering the surprise of the week. Now you can look at it on the other side, which is not Chinese immigrants to the United States, but the week as immigrant to China. And there is a kind of clash, and there is an uneven. I mean, it's more striking to historians of the subject, and therefore maybe more striking to me, that it succeeds so quickly and overwhelmingly. People talk about, the remarkable imposition, say in Japan, or in, the nationalist China in the early 20th century, of the Gregorian calendar, but in some ways the week there's nothing like the week in the timekeeping regimes of East Asia until 150 years ago, and then very quickly that is a dominant technology for organizing labor and leisure. So I'm more struck by the success, but there is all kinds of evidence of people not getting it, not liking it, employers not liking it, especially in Japan. I'll share one anecdote, which is that I spent a lot of time asking people and getting the same answer, which is, if someone says, let's meet on Wednesday the 14th, and then you look in your calendar and you see that there is no Wednesday the 14th, you usually assume that the person meant Wednesday the whatever day it is, because they'd be less likely to make that. And sometimes it's not the case, but that's the assumption. The only time I asked someone where they were very quick to say the opposite was in Tokyo. A woman, I would say, maybe born in the early 1940s, said that if someone told her we're going to meet on this date and this day, and they didn't align, she would assume the date was correct because that was fixed and solid on a number, and the other was just something else, and so someone could easily confuse that. So I saw that as, it's one story. I saw that as possibly something that's more likely to happen in a society that although it has officially adopted the week, has taken a little while to fully take it seriously as a description of how time works. But that's all I have for you.
All right, so we